Together we will form a more unified Nod.
Following the release of Command & Conquer 4 in March of 2010, the future of the Command & Conquer series was uncertain.
Peace through help!
The acclaimed real-time strategy series had enjoyed an incredible heyday, with a procession of critically acclaimed titles across both personal computers and consoles. But EA Los Angeles' Tiberian Twilight, which had vastly departed from the acclaimed real-time strategy series tenets, proved to be immensely unpopular with longtime fans and critics alike, casting the series' future in doubt. And yet, from its ashes, a new Command & Conquer title would emerge, Command & Conquer Generals 2. Taking place after the events of Command & Conquer Generals and its expansion, 0 Hour. Generals 2, from what little information was made available of it, seemed a solid counter to Tiberian Twilight's many mistakes, a return to the franchise's roots powered by EA's graphically impressive Frostbite engine. But before fans could confirm whether or not Generals 2 was truly the reversion that the series needed, it was announced that the game would be converted into a free-to-play platform simply titled Command & Conquer, and that it would launch in an aberration for the series without a single-player campaign. Fans would rail against the game's abrupt change in direction, prompting Victory Games, the game's developers, to do their best to address fans' concerns. But try as they might, Victory struggled to make headway on the project, until it was abruptly and unceremoniously canceled. This is the story of Command & Conquer Generals 2.
Kane's gone? Yeah, right.
In the aftermath of Tiberian Twilight's release, EA would divide and rebrand EA Los Angeles into two separate studios. The first, titled Danger Close, would inherit Los Angeles' first-person shooter assets and talent, and proceed to work on the Medal of Honor series, before being renamed DICE Los Angeles and assigned to the Battlefield franchise. The second, titled Victory Games, would inherit EA/LA's real-time strategy assets and talent and announce that it would be taking over the reins of the Command & Conquer franchise in February of 2011. However, at the Spike Video Game Awards in December, EA would unveil that BioWare, the acclaimed role-playing game developer behind the Mass Effect and Dragon Age series, was helming the next entry in the Command & Conquer franchise, Command & Conquer Generals 2, exclusively for the PC. Or so it seemed. In reality, Generals 2 was still being helmed by Victory Games, but now under the name BioWare Victory. BioWare's prime studio in Edmonton, Canada, would be largely uninvolved in the title's development, with only a few high-level executives such as studio co-founder Ray Muzica overseeing Victory's progress and speaking on behalf of them. Victory's rebranding represented less of a physical confluence of the two studios' talents and more its commitment to BioWare's style of high-quality emotional storytelling, which Victory would be attempting to bring to Generals 2. This would draw the ire of both Command & Conquer fans and members of the game's press alike, with some wondering if the rebranding was a disingenuous attempt to generate newfound interest in the franchise. Others expressed concern that BioWare's style of storytelling was an odd match for Generals, where BioWare mainstays such as Mass Effect featured deep storylines layered with emotionally wrought dialogue choices. Command & Conquer's narratives were historically straightforward and told through unabashedly cheesy cutscenes. However, speaking to IGN shortly after the game's announcement, Muzica would make it clear that while Victory was committed to creating emotionally engaging experiences, they were, quote, going to apply that vision in a way that makes sense for this genre and for the Command & Conquer series. Nonetheless, outside of the confusion surrounding the game's authorship, Generals 2 seemed to hold a lot of promise for the downtrodden series. Base building, resource management, and many other features that had been absent from Tiberian Twilight were back, with Victory's general manager John Van Caneghem of Might and Magic fame stressing to GameSpot that Generals 2, quote, is a return to the roots of core Command & Conquer gameplay. Fan-favorite mechanics unique to the original Generals and its expansion, such as 0 Hour's Generals system, whereby selecting a specific general to embody, would give players unique benefits and drawbacks on the field, would likely see a return. In addition, the game would be running on EA's newly minted Frostbite 2 engine, allowing for Generals 2 to feature a level of graphical fidelity and environmental destruction previously unseen in the series. While fans had reason to be apprehensive of Generals 2, what little information was available on the title suggested, at the very least, that BioWare Victory was taking steps to overcome the mistakes made during the development of Tiberian Twilight and do right by the franchise. And with a release window of 2013, they had plenty of time to do so. That is, until everything changed.
We decided to make Command & Conquer a free-to-play game. You know, it was definitely a big shift for us, and what it really came down to is Command & Conquer is ultimately, it's a strategy game, it's a tactical combat game.
You know, this game we're going to release as a live service. You know, it's online, and so, you know, part of the reason that we're scaling up the number of people that are in the game is to, you know, make sure that the scalability is there.
We came to a point in time where we were thinking, well, maybe we'll just make it a general sequel. But we felt like we were losing something by going just that traditional route. So it took a little bit of courage, but at the end of the day, we felt like live service was the right decision to make.
After close to a year of silence following the game's unveiling, Victory would reveal at Gamescom in August of 2012 that Generals 2 was being repurposed as a free-to-play service simply titled Command & Conquer. This Command & Conquer title would effectively function as a platform on which multiple universes based on each of the series' branches would be added to over time. A universe based on the Generals branch would launch alongside it, while universes based on the Tiberium and Red Alert series would hypothetically arrive later. While surprising, the move came on the heels of EA repeatedly asserting its belief in the viability of free-to-play models. Just a month prior, EA had announced that its blockbuster MMORPG Star Wars: The Old Republic would be going free-to-play as well. And the month before that, former EA COO Peter Moore, in an interview with Kotaku, had expressed his belief that the entire video game industry would shift towards the free-to-play model within the next 5 to 10 years. Command & Conquer would be EA's next step as it waded into an all free-to-play future. However, as a result of this shift, the game would no longer come packaged with a single-player campaign, with Van Caneghem explaining to PC Gamer that in its place, the free-to-play title's cooperative and competitive modes would serve as the core of the experience. Other game modes could be added based on player feedback, but were not being actively developed. Fans were dismayed. After being promised a traditional Command & Conquer experience in December, the game's sudden turn to being a multiplayer-only free-to-play experience was cause for concern. Even if the new title fixed much of the mechanical issues that beleaguered Tiberian Twilight, it would be a waste if it lacked a strong campaign in which the player would be given the opportunity to take advantage of them, or possessed exploitative microtransactions that rendered its multiplayer suite unbalanced. In response, EA would announce in September that the title would be receiving single-player content after all, affirming, as Caneghem had previously stated, that they were intently listening to fan feedback, but offered no further details. And shortly afterwards, in November, Victory would announce that it was reverting to being titled Victory Games, dropping its BioWare branding. The message was clear. The new Command & Conquer game might eventually get single-player content, but it was no longer a prime focus the way it once was when EA first announced Generals 2. Later that month, Command & Conquer fan site CNC Saga would come into possession of a series of storyboards, believed to have been drawn for what would have been Generals 2's pre-rendered cutscenes prior to it becoming a free-to-play game. While basic, the storyboards nonetheless possess a fleeting resemblance to the visual style and energy seen in BioWare Edmonton's own epics, making for an interesting trip into what could have been.
As we agreed, I surrender my sword in exchange for the city. For the lives of my men.
I should spare you a life of disgrace.
In December of 2012, EA would host a community summit for the new Command & Conquer, inviting prominent members of the franchise's online community an opportunity to play the title for the first time and offer their feedback. They found that the game had significant flaws in need of smoothing over, and the lack of any sort of emphasis on a single-player campaign remained a nearly universal sticking point with the community. But the team working on the title was passionate about it, open to criticism, and apparently not very fond of the game's move to free-to-play themselves. Likewise, when members of the video game press would get their hands on the title in February of the following year, impressions were cautiously optimistic. Many continued to express concern as to whether the title would be able to balance its new financial model with its desire to be a competitive experience once it properly launched. But what was there seemed promising at the time, with many praising the game's Onslaught mode, a cooperative multiplayer mode that pitted two players against waves of enemies controlled by AI. However, when the community would receive the opportunity to play the game's alpha preview several months later, they found that many of the same issues that they had previously identified with the game were still present and accounted for. Victory was as passionate as ever about their work, but progress on their game seemed to stand still. Public opinions would continue to sour throughout the rest of 2013, as more and more players entered the game's closed alpha, and too found themselves confronted with its many unresolved issues. The game continued to truck ahead, making the rounds at E3 in June with a stylish new trailer that showcased the game's playable generals, and at Gamescom in August with a trailer that teased the game's long-promised single-player content. But try as it might, Victory could do little more than march forward into oblivion.
EA found another way to make themselves unpopularer this week by cancelling the free-to-play Command & Conquer game and closing the studio that were developing it, Victory Games. The publisher has said they're going to try to help the devs find positions within EA, but that after receiving feedback on the alpha trial, they realized they were not making the game that fans were after. EA said they wanted to make the best game possible, and that is not what they're evolving towards.
On October 25th, Victory would lay out their plans for the future of Command & Conquer. After close to a year of testing the game's alpha with the Command & Conquer community, Victory announced that the game would receive a massive patch based on player feedback the following week, enter closed beta the following month, and then formally launch in 4 months in February of 2014. But then, on October 29th, the same day that Victory intended to roll out their latest update, EA would abruptly close Victory Games, canceling their nascent free-to-play title alongside it. In a statement released in the wake of the game's cancellation, Victory would claim that they had personally decided to cease production on the title because, quote, "We shifted the game away from campaign mode and built an economy-based multiplayer experience. Your feedback from the alpha trial is clear. We are not making the game you want to play." However, a day later, a post on the forum for the game's alpha by a developer known only as EA Baylor would claim that this was a lie, stating, quote, "It was not any feedback from the alpha that shut this project down, but just petty corporate politics and shenanigans." This statement would be followed up shortly afterwards by Command & Conquer community manager Eric Krause, who claimed that while the title absolutely had its share of problems, the decision to cancel the project came from EA, and that, quote, "There are many sides to the story of why exactly they decided to do so." Command & Conquer would see a final brief flicker of life in November of 2013, when an update on EA's support website claimed that the publisher would be offering people that purchased the C&C Ultimate Collection early access to a new beta on a later date, once production of the game resumes under a new studio. However, nothing would come of this. In 2017, former Victory Games developer John Lemaitre would delve deeply into the game's troubled development on Reddit. He claimed that of the game's many issues, its developers, true to fans' concerns, struggled the most to find a happy medium between making their game fair and competitively viable, and incentivizing players to continuously purchase advantageous upgrades to make it financially viable. This, along with a tendency to design the game's mechanics and systems more in the style of those seen in Blizzard Entertainment's StarCraft II than in Command & Conquer, hamstrung many aspects of the game's development. He also claimed that while the Frostbite engine enabled the game to look both stunningly beautiful and incredibly detailed, it also obfuscated the game's design, making it difficult for players to quickly and accurately survey everything that was on the battlefield. Enemy units obscured by shadows or debris, for example, would effectively be invisible without squinting. However, echoing Baylor and Krause, he would also affirm that the game's cancellation ultimately happened not as a result of any specific issue it faced, but as a result of corporate shuffling within EA. The leadership that terminated the project, he argued, was likely unaware of any of the issues that beleaguered it.
We believe that Command & Conquer has a core essence to it that will live on, hopefully, well into the next 10, 20, 30 years. You know, there's something about
this genre, real-time strategy, and something about this franchise, Command & Conquer, that really already for 17 years has kept players in the game.
Victory Games wanted nothing more than to do the Command & Conquer franchise proud. But the nature of their game's development meant that they were never given the opportunity to do so. Generals 2's abrupt switch from a narrative-driven Command & Conquer experience attempting to channel BioWare's spirit to a free-to-play service focused primarily on multiplayer muddled Victory's development timeline, created a host of new developmental issues, and scorned much of the series' faithful. The statement released in the wake of the game's cancellation may have been disingenuous as to the actual reasons why it was canceled, but it wasn't entirely wrong. As much as Victory had tried to make do with what they had, the time and circumstances afforded to the developers made it impossible for them to deliver the game that fans of the Command & Conquer franchise wanted. Our work is made possible by the generous support of our patrons. If you enjoy our content, consider subscribing to our channel and checking us out on Patreon. Thank you.